What if everything you thought you knew about one of philosophy's most controversial figures was fundamentally incomplete? What if the very ideas that have been used to dismiss and demonize Arthur Schopenhauer actually contain profound insights about human nature, relationship dynamics, and the art of conscious living? This isn't about defending outdated views or dismissing legitimate criticisms. This is about excavating wisdom from complexity, finding transformative insights within controversial territory, and discovering how even flawed perspectives can illuminate profound truths about consciousness, desire, and human connection. Before we dive into Schopenhauer's actual philosophy, we must acknowledge a fundamental truth about how historical ideas reach us. We live in an era of intellectual soundbites, where complex philosophical systems are reduced to inflammatory headlines and social media posts. Schopenhauer's views on women have been weaponized, distorted, and stripped of their philosophical context. What emerges is often a caricature, a convenient villain in the narrative of progress. But this approach robs us of genuine understanding and the opportunity for deeper insight. Consider this. When we dismiss entire philosophical systems based on selective fragments, we reveal more about our own psychological needs for certainty than about the actual content of those ideas. True intellectual courage requires us to engage with complexity, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, and to extract wisdom even from imperfect sources. Arthur Schopenhauer lived from 1788 to 1860, spanning a period of enormous social and intellectual transformation. His personal relationships were complicated, marked by difficulty with intimate connection and a profound sensitivity to human suffering that shaped his entire worldview. This isn't an excuse for problematic views, but rather an invitation to understand how personal psychology intersects with philosophical insight. Schopenhauer's relationship with his mother was turbulent. His romantic experiences were limited and often disappointing. These biographical details matter not because they justify his conclusions, but because they reveal the human experience from which his ideas emerged. When we examine Schopenhauer's broader philosophical system, we discover a mind obsessed with understanding the nature of suffering, desire, and the possibility of transcendence. His views on women cannot be separated from his fundamental belief that all human beings are trapped in cycles of wanting, striving, and inevitable disappointment. To understand Schopenhauer's perspective on gender relations, we must first grasp his core philosophical concept, the will to live. For Schopenhauer, this blind, irrational force drives all existence. It manifests as sexual desire, the urge to reproduce, the constant craving for more pleasure, more security, more validation. In Schopenhauer's framework, both men and women are victims of this will. Neither gender escapes its tyranny. The difference, in his view, lies in how this force expresses itself through different biological and psychological patterns. This is where modern readers often stumble. Schopenhauer viewed women as more directly connected to the will to live through their biological capacity for reproduction. In his understanding, this connection made women more intuitive, more emotionally intelligent in certain ways, but also more dominated by unconscious drives. Here's the crucial insight that gets lost in contemporary dismissals. Schopenhauer wasn't arguing that women were inferior. He was suggesting that different biological roles create different psychological patterns and forms of consciousness. One of Schopenhauer's most provocative insights concerns the nature of romantic attraction. He argued that what we experience as love is often the will to live, manipulating us into reproduction. The specific person we're attracted to represents our unconscious assessment of ideal genetic combination. This perspective, while reductive when taken as absolute truth, contains profound psychological wisdom. How often do we mistake biochemical drives for conscious choice? How frequently do our romantic decisions serve unconscious needs we barely recognize? Schopenhauer observed that women, in his view, possessed a more sophisticated understanding of these unconscious dynamics. They were, he suggested, more skilled at reading character, more attuned to long-term consequences, and more capable of strategic thinking in relational contexts. Modern psychology validates aspects of this observation. Research on emotional intelligence, intuition, and social cognition often reveals gender differences that align with some of Schopenhauer's insights. Though we now understand these differences as culturally constructed rather than biologically determined. One of Schopenhauer's most psychologically astute observations concerned the dynamics of desire and satisfaction. He noted that women often possessed an intuitive understanding of what we might now call psychological boundaries. The ability to create space, to withhold availability, to generate desire through strategic absence. This isn't manipulation in the negative sense. It's recognition that human psychology operates through tension, mystery, and the unknown. When someone is completely available, completely predictable, the psychological charge diminishes. When they maintain an element of inscrutability, desire intensifies. Consider your own experience. Which relationships have maintained their vitality over time? Often, it's those where both individuals preserve some degree of independence, some private inner territory that remains unexplored by their partner. Schopenhauer's insight here transcends gender. He was identifying a fundamental principle of human psychology. We desire what seems just beyond our reach, and we lose interest in what becomes too familiar or easily obtained. Schopenhauer frequently noted women's superior ability to read emotional undercurrents, to sense unspoken tensions, to navigate complex social dynamics. In his era, this was often dismissed as mere intuition or even deception. Today, we recognize these capacities as sophisticated forms of intelligence. Emotional intelligence involves the ability to perceive, understand, and manage emotions, both one's own and others. It requires attention to nonverbal cues, sensitivity to interpersonal dynamics, and the capacity to respond appropriately to social contexts. Schopenhauer's observation that women often excel in these areas wasn't meant as limitation, but as recognition of valuable cognitive abilities. The tragedy is that his historical context led him to view these capacities through a lens of biological determinism rather than cultural development. Perhaps Schopenhauer's most challenging insight concerns the nature of romantic love itself. He argued that what we call love is often projection, idealization, and unconscious biological programming masquerading as conscious choice. When we fall in love, Schopenhauer suggested, we're not seeing the other person clearly. We're seeing our own needs, fantasies, and biological imperatives reflected back to us. The beloved becomes a screen onto which we project our desires for completion, validation, and genetic continuity. This perspective feels cynical until we examine our own romantic histories. How many relationships have we entered believing we knew someone intimately, only to discover months or years later that we were in love with our own projections? Schopenhauer's insight here serves as invitation to conscious relationship. If we can recognize the projection dynamic, we can begin to see our partners more clearly. We can love them for who they actually are, rather than who we need them to be. Schopenhauer observed that women often demonstrated superior capacity for strategic thinking, particularly in relational and domestic contexts. They seemed more naturally inclined to consider long-term consequences, to plan for contingencies, to think systematically about resource allocation and family welfare. This observation, freed from its historical context of limited women's rights, reveals something profound about different cognitive approaches. While men in his era were often focused on immediate goals and competitive achievement, women were managing complex, long-term, multivariable systems, households, relationships, child-rearing, social networks. Modern research on cognitive differences suggests that these patterns reflect cultural conditioning rather than biological destiny. But the underlying insight remains valuable. Different life experiences cultivate different cognitive strengths. One of Schopenhauer's most psychologically sophisticated observations concerned women's mastery of indirect communication. Rather than viewing this as deception, we can understand it as sophisticated social intelligence. Indirect communication serves multiple functions. It preserves relationship harmony by avoiding direct confrontation. It allows for face-saving when difficult truths must be conveyed. It creates space for the other person to reach conclusions organically rather than feeling attacked or cornered. Consider the difference between saying, "You never help with housework," and "I've been feeling overwhelmed with the household tasks lately." The second approach invites collaboration rather than defensiveness. It communicates the same information while preserving the other person's dignity. Schopenhauer recognized this as a form of wisdom, not manipulation. It represents understanding of human psychology, recognition that direct confrontation often produces resistance rather than change. Here we must address the problematic aspects of Schopenhauer's views directly. His tendency toward biological determinism, the belief that gender differences are fixed by nature rather than shaped by culture, reflects the limitations of his historical moment. We now understand that many behaviors Schopenhauer attributed to female nature are actually responses to social constraints. When women in his era demonstrated indirect communication patterns, this often reflected their lack of social power rather than natural inclination. This recognition doesn't invalidate all of Schopenhauer's insights, but it requires us to separate the psychological observations from the biological explanations. The patterns he noticed may have been accurate. His interpretation of their origins was incomplete. Schopenhauer observed that women often wielded power through apparent vulnerability, through emotional expression, through the cultivation of others' protective instincts. In his framework, this represented a form of wisdom, recognition that direct confrontation isn't always the most effective approach to achieving one's goals. This insight transcends gender and speaks to fundamental principles of influence and persuasion. Sometimes apparent weakness is actually strength. Sometimes emotional expression is more powerful than logical argument. Sometimes appealing to others' better nature is more effective than demanding compliance. Consider the difference between insisting "you must help me" and expressing "I'm struggling and could really use your support." The second approach is more likely to generate genuine assistance because it appeals to the other person's capacity for compassion rather than triggering their resistance to being controlled. Schopenhauer noted women's natural understanding of the power of mystery, of maintaining some degree of inscrutability in relationships. This wasn't deception, but recognition that complete transparency can sometimes diminish psychological attraction. Mystery creates space for imagination, for projection, for the other person to invest emotionally in understanding us. When someone reveals everything about themselves immediately, there's nothing left to discover. When they maintain some private inner territory, they remain psychologically interesting. This principle applies beyond romantic relationships. In professional contexts, those who reveal everything about their capabilities immediately often seem less impressive than those who demonstrate competence gradually. In friendships, some degree of independence and separate interests keeps relationships vital. One of Schopenhauer's most practically applicable insights concerned the psychological dynamics of pursuit and retreat. He observed that women often intuitively understood the importance of not being completely available, of maintaining some degree of independence even within intimate relationships. This creates what psychologists now call intermittent reinforcement, a pattern of reward that maintains high levels of engagement because the outcome remains uncertain. When someone is completely predictable in their availability, the psychological excitement diminishes. When their presence feels somewhat earned or uncertain, desire intensifies. This doesn't advocate for game playing or manipulation. Rather, it suggests the importance of maintaining individual identity within relationships. The most satisfying partnerships involve two complete individuals choosing to share their lives, not two incomplete people trying to merge into one entity. Schopenhauer observed that women often demonstrated greater emotional fluidity, the ability to access and express a wider range of feelings, to move more quickly between different emotional states. To use emotion as information rather than being trapped by it. This capacity for emotional range can be understood as adaptive intelligence. Emotions serve as rapid information processing systems, alerting us to threats, opportunities, and relational dynamics that our conscious minds might miss. The ability to access this information quickly and accurately represents a form of practical wisdom. Modern neuroscience supports this observation, though it attributes emotional fluidity to cultural conditioning rather than biological programming. Regardless of its origins, the capacity to feel deeply while maintaining emotional flexibility represents a valuable life skill. Perhaps Schopenhauer's most profound insight, though he didn't frame it this way, concerns the integration of apparently opposite qualities. He noticed that women often combine traits that seemed contradictory: strength and vulnerability, logic and intuition, independence and connection. This integration of opposites represents psychological maturity. Most people identify primarily with one pole of various dichotomies, either strength or vulnerability, either logic or emotion, either independence or connection. The capacity to access both poles as circumstances require represents a more sophisticated form of consciousness. Consider your own psychological patterns. Do you identify primarily as strong or sensitive? As logical or intuitive? As independent or collaborative? What would change if you could access both poles of these dichotomies more fluidly? Schopenhauer's observations about women's relational patterns reveal deep insights about psychological boundaries. The ability to maintain individual identity while engaging intimately with others. Healthy boundaries aren't walls that keep others out. They're membranes that allow for selective permeability. They enable us to be open and vulnerable when appropriate, while maintaining our core sense of self. The capacity to say no is actually what makes yes meaningful. The ability to withdraw temporarily is what makes presence valuable. The maintenance of some private inner territory is what makes sharing feel like a gift rather than an obligation. The most transformative aspect of engaging with Schopenhauer's insights is recognizing that the psychological patterns he observed transcend gender categories. The wisdom he attributed to women can be cultivated by anyone willing to develop emotional intelligence, relational awareness, and strategic thinking. Similarly, the limitations he identified aren't inherent to any gender, but represent universal human challenges. We all struggle with unconscious motivation, projection in relationships, and the tendency to mistake biological drives for conscious choice. The goal isn't to argue whether Schopenhauer was right or wrong about gender differences. The goal is to extract psychological insights that can enhance our understanding of human nature and improve our capacity for conscious living. If we apply Schopenhauer's insights constructively, several practical principles emerge for creating more conscious relationships. First, recognize that attraction often involves projection. Take time to see your partner clearly rather than falling in love with your own fantasies about who they might be. Second, understand that some degree of independence and mystery enhances rather than threatens intimate connection. Maintain your individual interests, friendships, and inner life. Third, develop emotional intelligence and the capacity for indirect communication when appropriate. Sometimes gentle suggestions are more effective than direct demands. Fourth, cultivate strategic thinking about relationships. Consider long-term consequences rather than just immediate satisfaction. Fifth, practice the integration of apparent opposites, strength and vulnerability, logic and intuition, independence and connection. Modern evolutionary psychology provides context for some of Schopenhauer's observations while avoiding his biological determinism. Different evolutionary pressures may have shaped different psychological tendencies, but these are statistical patterns, not fixed destinies. More importantly, humans have the capacity to transcend evolutionary programming through conscious awareness. We can recognize our unconscious drives without being controlled by them. We can understand our psychological patterns without being limited by them. The goal isn't to argue that evolutionary influences don't exist. The goal is to develop enough consciousness to make choices based on our values rather than just our conditioning. Jung would later build on insights similar to Schopenhauer's by suggesting that psychological wholeness requires integrating our shadow aspects, the parts of ourselves we've disowned or rejected. If Schopenhauer's observations about gender differences contain any truth, perhaps they point toward psychological capacities that all humans need to develop. Men might need to cultivate emotional intelligence and relational awareness. Women might need to develop assertiveness and strategic thinking. But these aren't gender-specific needs. They're human developmental tasks. The most psychologically mature individuals, regardless of gender, tend to integrate a wide range of capacities rather than limiting themselves to culturally prescribed roles. Schopenhauer's fundamental insight concerns the difference between unconscious compulsion and conscious choice. His observation that both men and women are often driven by forces they don't understand remains profoundly relevant. The path to freedom involves developing awareness of our unconscious patterns. When we can see our projection dynamics, our biological drives, our conditioned responses, we gain the power to choose whether to follow them. This doesn't mean suppressing natural impulses, but rather developing the capacity to engage with them consciously. We can feel attraction without losing our judgment. We can acknowledge emotional needs without being controlled by them. We can recognize strategic considerations without becoming manipulative. Perhaps the most profound lesson from engaging with Schopenhauer's controversial views is learning to hold paradox. We can appreciate psychological insights while rejecting problematic conclusions. We can find wisdom in flawed sources while maintaining critical judgment. This capacity for nuanced thinking is essential in our polarized era. Most complex ideas contain both wisdom and limitation. Most historical figures demonstrate both insight and blindness. The ability to extract value while discarding what's harmful represents intellectual and emotional maturity. How might we apply these insights constructively in contemporary contexts? In romantic relationships, we can recognize that initial attraction often involves projection and take time to develop genuine knowledge of our partners. We can maintain individual identities while building intimate connections. We can practice both direct and indirect communication as situations require. In professional contexts, we can develop emotional intelligence alongside technical skills. We can learn to read interpersonal dynamics and respond strategically. We can cultivate the ability to influence through inspiration rather than just authority. In personal development, we can work toward integrating apparently opposite qualities. We can develop both emotional sensitivity and logical analysis. We can cultivate both independence and collaborative capacity. We can practice both strength and vulnerability as circumstances require. Perhaps the ultimate insight from engaging with Schopenhauer's complex legacy is recognizing that consciousness itself evolves. The psychological patterns he observed in his era reflected specific cultural and historical conditions. As those conditions change, human consciousness adapts and develops. We're not bound by the limitations of previous generations, but we can learn from their insights. We can appreciate what they understood about human nature while transcending their conceptual limitations. The goal isn't to return to past models of gender relations, but to integrate psychological wisdom from all sources, while continuing to evolve toward more conscious, equitable, and fulfilling ways of living. What have we discovered in this journey through Schopenhauer's controversial territory? We've found that even problematic historical perspectives can contain genuine insights about human psychology. We've learned that the capacity to hold paradox, appreciating wisdom while rejecting limitation, represents intellectual maturity. Most importantly, we've uncovered practical principles for more conscious living. The importance of recognizing projection in relationships. The value of maintaining individual identity within intimate connections. The wisdom of developing emotional intelligence alongside logical analysis, and the art of integrating apparent opposites. Schopenhauer's views on women, freed from their historical context and biological determinism, reveal timeless insights about human consciousness. desire, and the possibility of transcending unconscious compulsion through awareness. The question isn't whether Schopenhauer was right or wrong about gender differences. The question is whether we can extract psychological wisdom from complex sources while continuing to evolve toward more conscious, compassionate, and equitable ways of living. In the end, the greatest insight may be this: human consciousness is not fixed, but constantly evolving. We can honor the wisdom of the past while transcending its limitations. We can develop the psychological capacities that serve human flourishing regardless of gender, culture, or historical moment. The art of conscious living involves neither rejecting the past nor being trapped by it, but rather extracting wisdom from all sources while continuing to grow toward our highest potential. In this light, even controversial historical figures like Schopenhauer can serve as teachers, not because their conclusions were perfect, but because their observations about human nature contain enduring insights for those willing to engage with complexity and paradox. This is the ultimate invitation: to develop the intellectual courage to engage with difficult ideas, the emotional intelligence to hold paradox, and the practical wisdom to apply insights constructively in our own lives and relationships. Through this approach, we honor both the wisdom of the past and the possibility of future growth.